you. Thank you. So I'm going to sit and encourage you to think of this as like a conversation. This is somewhat preliminary work, and I'm really looking forward to thinking with you about it. So before I begin, I really wanted to say thank you to Arte Público and the Recovery Project for hosting, and Gabby and Carolina, thank you. It's just been an incredible pleasure to be here. I also wanted to thank my collaborator, Jeremy Boggs, who's the head of research and development at the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia. And thanks a great deal to MITH staff. So Trevor Munoz, Grace Babukika, Stephanie Sapienza, Ed Summers, Raf Vigilante, and Kirsten Keister, as well as Catherine Knight Steele and Jovan Bickerstaff and Jessica Liu, and the entire team for the African American Digital Humanities project, which is run out. It's a collaboration between MITH and the College of Arts and Letters at the University of Maryland. So they have continued to enrich conversations that always improve my thinking around archives and advocacy by design and many other topics. So I am going to read a little bit because I'm still like slightly nervous about this. So I apologize ahead of time. I want to frame my talk around a quote from the Community Futures Lab co-director Rashida Phillips from her workshop on time, memory, and justice in marginalized communities. She states, "Oral futures is about speaking into existence what you want to have happen." And I want to think with you today about how such future-making materials are collected, how they're preserved, how they're made accessible in moments of extreme climate change and the attending displacements of people and animals due to environmental and political economic erosion of homelands and sites of cultural heritage. So we cannot save everything, which as an archivist student, I was horrified by. I was like, what? And over time, I've realized that we might not actually want to save everything. And so decisions have to be made about what to keep and what to discard. These decisions encode and reflect particular values, particular privileges, and power structures. Some decisions about what to be kept go against a community's desire for privacy. And this in particular is a conversation that Hume has really enriched. There is a tension between surveillance and privacy. There's a tension between being able to name or erase a particular set of materials. Yvonne Perkins writes, "In the past, people such as women, non-Europeans, Aboriginals, the poor, and others were not considered important contributors to our history, so their stories are often not portrayed in archival records. They were obscured in the archive by social conventions of the time." Archives in this usage, I mean institutional archives as well as community archives, and even further, the digital collections that are curated by scholars. And these archives do not exist only to explain or contextualize the past, but also signal towards and shape futures. Archives call to the fore the processes of preservation and memory and access. And as Britt Stoley notes, attending to these processes carry uncomfortable questions of who decides what is significant to carry forward, in whose memory is the past best preserved, and how do we, and who exactly counts as the we, determine the ethical framing through which to focus our efforts of preservation and future shaping. Okay. So absences and obfuscations, every time I write that word, I kill myself because I can't say it. So absences and obfuscations are referred to as archival silences. Michel Rolfe Trio outlines the many ways voices in the past are silenced. There is a silencing in making the sources. So which events even get described or remembered in a manner that allows them to be collected later. Not everything is recorded in such a way that they can be collected. There's a silencing in the creation of the archives. And in this usage, TRIO means the repositories of historical collections, less so community archives or digital collections that scholars are creating. At times, this archival silencing is permanent since the records do not get preserved. And at other times, the silencing is in the process of competition for the attention of the narrators, the later tellers of historical tales. And thirdly, the narrators themselves necessarily silence much. In much of history, archives are massive. Choices, selection, and valuing must be done. In this process, huge areas of archives are silenced. these silences occur along a spectrum of accidental to intentional, from the creation of records to the identification of such records as valuable. And these values, which are set within formal institutional repositories, often reflect the needs and the power structures of the state. And to the resources to preserve and carry forward records, as well as the ways in which records are described, cataloged, and organized. Further, silencing can occur at sites of the sources and records that are suppressed, that are lost, damaged, or destroyed through climate change. Okay. So I've sort of been backing into a definition of archives here, and I want to contrast my thinking about archives with the Society for American Archives. So they have quite an extensive definition, and I'd like to read three of their points, their first note, their fourth, and their fifth on defining what archives are. So the first point are materials created or received by a person, family, or organization, public or private, in the conduct of their affairs, and preserved because of the enduring value contained in the information they contain, or as evidence of the functions and responsibilities of their creators. The fourth definition is the professional discipline of administrating such collections and organizations, and then the fifth is the building or portion thereof housing archival collections. And what this definition obscures are the variety of non-institutional community archives and collections of digital sources curated by scholars. And these are in a particular research agenda. These curation, so often what we talk about as digital humanities or digital archives are sort of collected and gathered in a particular intention. And they're pieces that are pulled out of context of other archival collections. And I think that's a really important distinction. Further, the Society for American Archivists definition understates the extremely nuanced and value-laden decisions that drive how archives identify material and process those materials for public use. So from an archivist definition or an archivist view, and I will hinge this as an archivist working in the digital humanities, archives are repositories which collect unique and rare materials from outside sources through donation or purchase, which are based on specific collection goals. And making these materials accessible via a series of practices that range from organizing and arrangement, naming and describing practices, as well as decisions regarding access and privacy. And the documentation of these decisions is not often easily accessible by researchers or users of a collection. And further, the SAA, the Society for American Archivists, definition sidesteps the constructs of pasts and futures, as well as the processes in which those pasts and futures are navigated and imagined through seemingly a neutral stance. So as Mario Ramirez writes, the continued assertions of neutrality and objectivity and a rejection of the political take for granted an archival subject that is not only homogeneous or free of racial stereotypes, societal influence, prejudice, and political options, but it also supports whiteness and white privilege in a profession and within the archival holdings. And here I lean on Michelle Caswell's observation that what is construed as neutral is a matter of perspective, and that such perspectives remain limited given the general homogeneity of the archival field. So for the most part, archives and archivists tend to be extraordinarily white. And there is an inherent violence in archival work. There's a silencing and obscuring of people and sources, creating and sustaining hierarchies through collection practices that value some voices and some experiences over others. And these are further, there's a further violence through naming practices, which include controlled vocabularies and description, as well as hiding or devaluing labor that's involved in this work. As archives are underfunded, there's a great deal of contract and student labor in processing archival collections, which is often sort of invisible when a user comes to the archive. Okay. So, all right. So Terry Cook emphasizes that from the ancient world to the present, women, and I would add here, people of color, LGBT communities, and other non-white, heteronormative, able-bodied people have been delegitimized in archival processes. So the question that I continue to come back to is, how can we deconstruct the silencing and archival violence to build an anti-violent, anti-racist, womanist practice instead? And within this reflective, critical archival work, how do the concerns of climate change put pressure on and reshape the striving for practice? Okay. So you get one textless slide. So, and actually I love this picture. It's like railroad tracks and then like scrub trees kind of growing out of the abandoned tracks. So the term Anthropocene signals the current movement, or the current moment, of mass extinctions and climate change resulting from human activities. But as Donna Haraway suggests, it's both too big and too small of a term. It posits a universal, and in her words, it's as if humanity or man did this thing, meaning climate change or environmental damage, without connecting this damage to the processes of building wealth through extermination and extraction of animals, people, and natural resources. Haraway suggests the term Capitalocene to better situate human activities within robust networks of animals and plants and within timescales of near and distant pasts and futures. So for this talk, I'm using the more familiar Anthropocene, but drawing on the messier networks, and timescales of the Capitalocene, which I find like kind of an awkward term. So I'm defaulting to the Anthropocene, but I'm sort of flagging that it's like a really problematic term. There's an excellent book called Anthropocene Feminisms, which I highly recommend, and they further complicate this, this sort of usage of Anthropocene. Okay. So my usage intends to focus on the social, political, and economic pressures that are connected or result from the processes of extermination and extraction of resources, that these processes displace millions of people, leading to an even greater pressure on the records and the sites of memory and heritage. So as scholars, digital practitioners, librarians, and archivists, striving for a more just practice for collecting and describing and stewarding the sources of cultural memory, I lean on David Wallace's outline of a social justice approach to archives. And it's a bit of a block quote, so I apologize. So he begins that the social justice approach to archive embraces ambiguity over clarity, accepts that social memory is always contestable and reconfigurable, that understands that politics and political power is always present in the shaping of social memory, and considers that archives and archival praxis always exist within the context of power, but recognizes that this is a paradox because archives and archivists situated as both like weak social power, but have significant social memory shaping potential. So there's always this like tension of like, there's a claim of power in the archive, but there's not a great deal of easily grabbable power for archivists, you know? And so he continues that this sort of social justice practice of archives acknowledges that social justice itself is ambiguous and contingent on dissimilar space, time, and cultural contexts. And so with this in mind, I'm gonna pivot a little bit to a reflection of an approach that Jeremy Boggs and I have been working on called Advocacy by Design. And as I said, it's preliminary work, so I'm sort of, let's hold archives in one hand, let's hold Anthropocene in another, and then this is sort of me backing into a reflection around praxis and how we might begin to approach this, these questions. So Jeremy and I started working on something that we've titled Advocacy by Design in 2014. And 2014 at the University of Virginia was a truly awful year. I've never actually experienced quite such a terrible year until then. And so it begins, there was a disappearance and murder of a University of Virginia undergraduate student by the name of Hannah Graham. And there were several other disappearances of women of color that were not covered in the news nearly as much as the disappearance of Hannah Graham. There was a Rolling Stone article titled After a Rape that was in conversation with Hannah's disappearance and murder. And there was a further assault on an African-American student leader, Martise Johnson, by the alcohol and beverage control agents. And through all of this, there was an increasingly enraged campus, legitimately. But very problematically, there was an increasing and very discordant rise of like, how could this happen here? Like, we never knew that this could happen. And together with Professor Lisa Goff, who's in the American Studies and English departments now, we're just like, are you kidding me? Like, seriously? And so she's like, it's been happening since 1854, and started a public archive that could begin to document this very rich and complex history of both sexual violence at the university and the pushback of women's groups and activist groups that are like, we need to do some intervention here. And so Jeremy and I felt along with Lisa and her incredible team, that this archive needed to be feminist at the core, that feminist principles had to be present and visible at every stage of this project, from the way that we collected materials to the way that we worked with folks who were giving their histories, to the description and the organizing of the metadata, as well as to the interface. And this is a speculative interface that Jeremy and I are working on that engages with principles of rich prospect browsing, so to show everything in the archive, as well as a timeline that can kind of indicate, like, based on the materials in the archive, these different events have different sized collections within it. And so as we were kind of working through a lot of this material, we decided that this sort of feminist mode of engagement could be extended to other projects. And so Advocacy by Design articulates a shared understanding and practice that fronts questions of how are people represented and are subjects of our academic work, questions of who reads and uses our work, as well as how do we collaborate and contribute to others' work and ask people to contribute to our own. So we articulated this advocacy through particular stances on a number of interrelated concepts that we call principles. And some of these principles are borrowed from Shawin Barzel's HCI, which is taking stock and outlining agenda for design. And others grew out of our experience with Take Back the Archive. All right. So these are a few of the principles, and elements are considered like enactable objects. So like you have a principle of transparency, but then what does that actually look like on the interface? And so what are the things, the pieces that you can use to deploy a stance on polyvocalism? So for Take Back the Archive, that sort of rich prospect browsing, that we wanted to have multiple narratives through the interface or through the collection rather than a single view. And so the elements are a way to make visible the principles within our workflows and our interactions and our research products. Then Advocacy by Design is not prescriptive. We really kind of resisted having a list of principles and a list of elements side by side because we don't want it to be considered like a checklist. Like you can go through and check these things off. It's really meant as an invitation of a way of practicing and a way to return and reflect on the how and the why of our work. So like, why are we doing this work and how is it being reflected? How are those goals being reflected back out through the interface? And so when thinking about archives in the Anthropocene, the principles of transparency, stewardship, polyvocalism, and an ethic of care emerge as, for me, sort of ways of enacting or reflecting on a justice-based or an advocacy-based approach to archival practice. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time briefly with Carole Gilligan's ethic of care. And because she sets out a feminist ethic of care is an ethic of resistance. It's a resistance to the injustices inherent in the patriarchy. In this, she means that there's an association of care and caring with women rather than with humans, and that there is a feminization of care work, as well as the rendering of care as less important, even though it is linked with justice. And Ricky Punzalan and Michelle Caswell ask, what happens when we begin to think of record keepers and archivists as caregivers? Bound to the record creators, the subjects, and the users through a web of mutual responsibility. And I sit with this question quite a bit. This is like a really compelling question. I don't have an answer to it. I'm like, I want to flag this as something that is something that we could hold. And in this, like, how does it shift our collaborations with communities, with scholars, with activists, and record keepers? And how does an ethic of care shift how we collect materials, how we analyze them, how we prioritize records? This is the last part of her quote, which I really like, that it directs our attention to the need of responsiveness in relationships. So this is, again, not a static thing, but something that's quite iterative and that comes back and it shapes and evolves based on the relationships that emerge. So an ethic of care provides a way to think through our responses and responsibilities and position the human condition as one of connectedness, one of interdependence. And in this, it echoes Donna Haraway's call for us to recognize and honor the interconnections between people, plants, and animals, and the planet in an effort to create and foster, and I really like this, create, foster, and defend places of refuge. And that's another thing that kind of just I hold quite a bit, and thinking about ways in which archives can be places of refuge, and what would that look like in practice. And I really like the way Haraway plays around with this term like responsibilities and creates it like, what are our abilities to respond? And then what are our responsibilities within that response? And I think that's a really nice interplay, particularly when thinking about archives in a very tense ecological moment. So I wanted to share a couple of very quick examples about how principles and elements might work in an existing project. So this is a screenshot from Documenting the Now, which is a project that is at the University of St. Louis and at MITH. And it works on creating communicating, it's essentially a social media gathering space. It's a tool to gather and archive social media. But one of the things that I think it does brilliantly is communicates the technical infrastructure and project decisions and through a variety of platforms. So they have a very active Slack channel, which is sort of an instant messenger place. And they have newsletters and a GitHub account. So all of these are sort of elements of transparency. You can really clearly see a record of the discussions that are happening. And the other reason that I think this transparency is really critical is because Burgess Jules and Ed Summers, who are project leads, Documenting the Now arose out of the shooting in Ferguson and sort of the social media response of activists trying to organize around Black Lives Matter. And as in this moment of great intense organizing, there's also a sort of counter surveillance by the police, and a lot of these activists are being targeted. So what are our responsibilities in gathering these social media collections where people know that they're tweeting, but they're not looking at a long-term how these tweets might be accessible or used by people that they don't want to be used. So in this, there is a significant amount of conversation about like what are our responsibilities and what are the ethics around this kind of collection, and building a tool that makes this collection very, very easy. And so to have a really nice set of places where you can see what those conversations are and track how decisions are being made, I think is a really excellent example. And Ed has said that connecting and collaboration with communities, particularly activists, it's a slower process. It's much more complicated. And yet this practice can support our reflection on biases inherent within traditional collection policies. And it particularly is important to decide what's valuable and what's worth collecting. And it also means that we must address what collaboration looks like and mean within the library and archives, with particular attention to what the power structures are inherent and which power structures are tacit with collaborators. Okay. So that's one. This is another quick example. This is a website that emerged from the D Post-Colonial Digital Humanities course at Hilt in 2015. Rupika Rassam and Micah Cardenas. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced the name. They collaborated with participants to develop a resource for designing digital humanities research that demonstrated commitments to social justice. So there were 11 participants in the class, and they shared their work publicly with an explicit invitation for others to contribute prompts and resources around the categories of access, material conditions, methods, ontologies, and epistemologies that shape the digital humanities. And in their words, the goal here is to make visible the critical and theoretical processes that subtend digital humanities practices. And the thing that I think is so nice about this particular site, in addition to like the very thoughtful way it's been put together, is that it includes prompts. And prompts that are not often like at the forefront of someone's mind when they're starting to build a digital collection. And I think their main audience are digital humanists interested in building digital archives, which as an archivist, we would say these are digital collections rather than digital archives, but that's splitting hairs. So some of the prompts include: how accessible is the project for people with disabilities? How accessible is the project in low bandwidth environments? So not every community has the same amount of bandwidth. How can people get to the site and use the materials in a way that takes into account differences in infrastructure? Whose voices are absent from these archives? And it has links for practitioners to resources that can help think through some of these prompts. So some readings and other things. So these are two different existing projects that I really like to highlight in the sense that they have nice, clear examples of principles that, they did not necessarily build these projects with advocacy and by design in mind, but they're clear deployment of elements. Okay. And so I returned to Moya Bailey's article on Transform DH, Writing and Research and Autoethnography of Digital Humanities and Feminist Ethics. And her quote is, "If my work and aims are not in collaboration with the communities I wish to talk with, then I'm not doing the right work." And I think that this is another really clear point for digital humanists to be kind of in conversation with. Like, we do a lot of research, we create a lot of digital spaces and digital tools. Are these tools authentically in conversation with the people that are represented within them, or that they're intended users? So with community collaborations, we can create and describe collections that show and offer modes of manipulation that resist a single explanation or narrative. And it's incredibly important to make visible the decisions that are made, from the selection and description to discovery, because these decisions are interpretive and can reinscribe erasures and exclusions. Particularly when materials are gathered from those whose own cultural documentational methods, are not considered valid or valuable to the institution. So I think here about some of the indigenous knowledge categories that are not always included in some of the Society for American Archivists or the Library of Congress best standard practices, right? So some categories and ways of knowing are not visible or accepted in other categories and ways of knowing, and then that tension is sometimes invisible to scholars who are coming in, who are new to the digital humanities, and they're told, follow, the Library of Congress subheadings. That's what you do to make yourself findable. But there are inherent biases and racism that are embedded in those subject headings. Okay. And then I'll kind of skip over this a little bit. This is a library, sort of a back-end library thing called Project Blacklight. And the reason that I think this is important is it's an excellent example of documentation. There's a quick start guide that gives clear indication of like what are the skills that you need to know and where you can go in order to get those skills if you don't have them. And they do this in a really nice way. And it's not with the intention of reducing the documentation to sort of meet all skill levels, but rather point people towards clear avenues of how to best use Project Blacklight, but also gain the skills that they need in order to engage with the documentation in a meaningful way. So I think this is an excellent, they do a brilliant job with their documentation. And I think only like the really nerdiest of digital humanists and archivists get excited about documentation. so I won't spend a ton of time here. So this returns me to Bardzell, who asks us to attend to the broadest context of stakeholders. So within this context of information platforms and systems, could we be more transparent to our communities about who is building the software? And in what environment, what skills are expected to best utilize these platforms and systems, and where one could acquire such skills. Oftentimes documentation is boringly dry, it puts people to sleep, and it's really unclear, like how do you even begin to parse what this thing that looks kind of like English, but it puts people to sleep, so what is it, right? So where would you even go to begin to decode this kind of thing? So I think our documentation can become a lot less obscure, essentially, or intentionally obscure. And so sharing that documentation and access to the platforms offer doorways for users to see the most recent version. And in the best cases, it empowers people to pull the code, to change it, and to contribute back. And I say best cases because that's asking a lot. That's asking people to be familiar with GitHub, to be familiar with the ways in which you could send pull requests to say, hey, I changed this thing. But given that we know that that's kind of a high step, are there ways that we can imagine documentation that is welcoming, that's simple to read, and that communicates how the systems or platforms work? And I think really key here is like who contributed to it, who built this thing, and if there are ways that we can contribute clarity in that, I think we do a great service to a broader community. Okay, how's the time? Should I speed things up a little bit? Okay. So in an attempt to sort of return to the questions posed at the beginning, how do we grapple with the uncomfortable questions of who decides what is significant to carry forward? in whose memory is the past best preserved? And then how do we determine who counts as we? I think that's a really critical thing. And in that determination, we then begin to pre-select some of the ethical frameworks that guide our efforts for preservation and for future shaping. So the following 3 examples point to archival possibilities. And I want to underscore the possibilities part rather than the firm statement. The 2 point to alternative modes of archival practice, while the 3rd gestures to notions of non-human archival practice. And this is the one I would love to talk about more because I'm still a little shaky on it. But I'm particularly influenced by Jessica Marie Johnson's digital maroon communities. And so again, this is somewhat of a big quote, but it's really, for me, it's sort of a touchstone of how I approach digital humanities and how I think through like archives and some of the attending pressures of the Anthropocene. So the beginning of the quote is, the digital and doing digital work has created and facilitated insurgent and maroon knowledge creation within the ivory tower. It's imperfect and it's problematic, and we are all imperfect and problematic. But in that sense, I think the digital humanities, or doing digital work, period, has helped people create maroon, meaning free, black, liberatory, radical spaces in the academy. I feel that there is a tension between thinking about digital humanities as an academic construct and thinking about what people do with the tools and digital ways of thinking. DH has offered people the means and opportunities to create new communities, and this type of community building should not be overlooked. It has literally saved lives as far as I'm concerned. People, those who have felt alone or maligned, or those who have been marginalized or discriminated or bullied, have used digital tools to survive and to live, and that's not academic. If there isn't a place for this type of work within what we are talking about as digital humanities, then I think we are having a faulty conversation, and that's the end of her. She's absolutely brilliant. If you look up one person in digital humanities, Jessica Marie Johnson, she's like, yeah, she's insane. So many of the challenges and opportunities Johnson raises for the digital humanities are parallel to archival work in a moment of intensely unevenly distributed violences and protections and sanctuaries. And I think Marissa Parham's use of Toni Morrison's concept of rememory is really useful here too, that there are memory and memory work that's not totalizing, but is always contextualized in time and space. So I wanted to share 3 possibilities, archival possibilities. So this is a slide of upcoming events for the Community Futures Lab. And there's a sort of an indication of the past, the immediate past, a present, immediate future, and sort of no time, far time, and potential time, and how these events are connected. And the Community Futures Lab this is a description from their Facebook page. So Community Futurisms, Time and Memory in North Philly, is a social practice, a collaborative art, and an ethnographic research project exploring oral histories, memories, alternative temporalities, and futures within the North Philadelphia neighborhood known as Sharswood-Bloomberg. The area is currently undergoing a major redevelopment project after years of deep poverty, educational inequality, and crime. Community Futurisms will document the redevelopment of the Sharswood-Bloomberg neighborhood through a multidisciplinary community art project that explores the intersections of futurism, literature, visual remixing, sound, and activism as art. And so at the work of the Community Futures Lab is a gallery, a library, a workspace, a time capsule, a recording booth, and a community center where Rashida Phillips acts as a housing lawyer. She's actively helping people understand what their tenant rights are. At a moment where this neighborhood is like actively trying to displace people in order to put up fancier buildings. And so I think a lot of the work that the Community Futures Lab is doing, particularly in taking objects and recording oral histories around the use and pasts of these projects with the intention of sort of speaking in, that beginning quote, like speaking into existence some of the adjacent possible futures with folks in the neighborhood is deeply in spirit with Jarrett Drake's abolitionist archive concept, in which he means community and grassroots archives which work to eradicate structures of violence as they work to imagine and implement more just structures that support equality for all people. So the Community Futures Lab is working to resist displacement and explain or contextualize the past experiences of this neighborhood, but also signal towards and shape futures. So it's deeply engaged with this notion of polyvocalism, that there are many different resistance, these small and big, in terms of this gentrification that's happening, and particularly because the overarching narrative of the gentrification is that it's complete, and there are people like, nope, we're still here, and that it's unevenly distributed among the community members. And I think that this project in particular is really interested in a sort of stewardship that kind of is in conversation with archival materials and sort of outside of a conversation with archival materials. Because it does not scope a timeline, there's no end date for this project. There's no sense of like how long these oral histories will be kept, by which institution. It's really intended to be sort of like this documenting of right now with the intention of sort of imagining and building a new future. And so it's a significant attention, the stewardship to the care, both of the stories, but also to the community members. And so as an archive in the Anthropocene, Community Futures Lab reminds us not to forget Haraway's critique of the term, that the Anthropocene can be both too small too big and too universalizing to capture the local pressures exerted by capitalism. It resists what David Edwards has named as dead priorities, meaning money, capital, profit, and begins to speak into existence living priorities, meaning people, plants, animals, the earth. And it's looking at it at a neighborhood scale. You know, this is like a tiny neighborhood. It's not under environmental threat, except that these like forces of capitalism and displacement are acting in multiple different places. So there's growth in some place and displacement in others. So a very different project is the Future Library Project. And this is an art and forestry and literary project led by artist Katie Patterson. And it's a tractive forest that's being planted in Oslo, or just outside of Oslo, Norway, with the intention that in 100 years, a manuscript will be printed, but up until that point, unread. So the first manuscript to be submitted in trust to be held for 100 years was by Margaret Atwood. Then David Mitchell was the year after, a Norwegian poet, and now Elif Shafak, she's a Turkish novelist. And so each author submits a manuscript that will be held for 100 years, unread, and then be printed on the trees harvested from this tract of land. And the principles that I think that are significant here is this kind of notion of stewardship, but again, slightly a different take than the Community Futures Lab. This is sort of a stewardship of forestry and it's sort of the earth, but it's also a commitment to the care of the materials, so these manuscripts are held in trust, and to the skills. The thing that I find really interesting about this project is that not only are the manuscripts held, but there's a printing press being held and periodic workshops on how to use a printing press. And I'm like, that's a really apocalyptic vision for 100 years. I'm like, slow down now, right? Because like that's kind of nuts that maybe we won't have printed books in 100 years. But I do think it's a really interesting element, right? It's sort of speculative element about like what humanity looks like. And the other question that sort of really undergirds this is like, who gets to speak about now to those 100 years from now? Because that won't be us, right? And so the thing that I think is really great about this project, I was getting a little nervous. You know, there's like Margaret Atwood, then there's David Mitchell, and then there's this like lovely white Norwegian poet. And I'm like, oh, let's talk about people of color here, particularly about speculating about future, right? So then I started to do a bit more investigating, and they have articulated a vision where the board members rotate every 10 years with the intention of purposely moving who gets to decide which authors are selected. So I think that that's really a nice thing. I'm not 100% sure how it will evolve, but the idea is that it will be iterative, and that this board will change. And so hopefully there'll be a broadening of who gets to speak now to the future. Right. Okay. And so the last one, and I will say I'm a little nervous about this. So the final possibility for considering archives in the Anthropocene are what Susan Weisner and others have termed accidental archives. So in this sense, there are huge sort of islands of trash that are like held in ocean currents. They're invisible, yet they exist in many ways, and sometimes they become intensely visible as pieces of them break off and come up to shore, right? So archives of trash or ocean plastics, they have no formal process of selection, except that our contributions act as an accession strategy gone wrong. And that these gatherings are sorted in some ways by ocean currents, by fish, by animals, that sort of some plastics fall to the bottom, and there's a deep concern about filter feeders encroaching on the plastics. And there are scientists and environmentalists who are looking to see if they can read these archives, I'm using it extremely loosely, to begin to speculate on the consequences of what happens when these giant spaces of trash have pieces that break off, right? And so I think that there are notions within this idea of an accidental archive that are in conversation with things like post-custodial archives, which is an idea that archivists will no longer physically acquire or maintain records, but that they will collaborate with communities to assist the management of records which remain in the custody of the individuals or the communities of origin. And so here, and again, this is the part that I'm like the most interested in having a conversation, because if we think about these ocean trash islands as an archive, that there is not a single community of origin. We're all responsible. Yet, and it again comes back to this idea of the Anthropocene, it is unevenly distributed. There are countries of origin who contribute more trash, and that there are countries and peoples who bear the cost of that trash in much higher, significant ways. And so this kind of space highlights the primary challenge of the Anthropocene, where the protection and preservation of some ecologies and communities come at the cost of other ecologies and other communities. Okay, so it's highly speculative. So the lens of the Anthropocene gives us a way to look at large-scale threats and pressures and to conceptualize local responses, to move between two views, attending to particularly the practices of making, keeping, and utilizing records for memory. It gives us a way to consider what our abilities to respond currently are and ways to imagine what our responses could be. So as an archivist, I'm concerned about how these incredible and powerful archives will be carried forward so that they may continue to speak the future into being. The collaboration between liberatory, or as Drake suggests, abolitionist archives and critical archives such as Caswell, Sangwon, and Punzalan helps us connect Jessica Marie Johnson's maroon communities of DH in the anticipation that these archives and archival projects help us better imagine and construct more just infrastructures that resist violence, that they resist that sort of silencing act, and better protect the materials from which we may speak into being the many possible paths and many possible futures. So thank you. This is very preliminary, so I very much welcome thoughts. I feel like I shared some half-baked thoughts with you. I was hoping that they're not half raw. Hopefully there's like more baked than raw. Yeah, that's a great question, and one I wish I had a better answer to. So on one hand, I lean on some of the Creative Commons licensing, so there's ways to sort of link collections together through licensing. I think that we can do a great deal with linked open data and sort of thinking about how we make permanent connections between institutions and collections, but knowing how challenged particularly archives that have finding aids, but they don't necessarily have a great deal of funds or technical experts to put those finding aids online. It's sort of the big dream of how do we do a universal search across all the archives. I mean, it's almost impossible, to be honest. So I think some of it comes back to those there are people within those networks that know about the collections and that they can share with each other. So some of it is in like community building. I think some of it comes into, and this might be too much of a lean, but I like Saida Hartman's use of critical fabulation. So like being able to like critically imagine and tell stories about the materials in the archive to make these speculative connections between them, whether we can prove those connections are real or not. And I think that there is some really radical potential there to sort of speak into being connections between archives. But I know a lot of archivists would disagree with me there. And I think that would be sort of more of my digital humanities hat than it would be of an archivist hat, because, you know, her work on, she does some really great work on the limits of that method of sort of that critical speculation of stories. And so I think she's a really great voice for that sort of, are there ways that we can begin to talk into being, to speak into being connections that we might not have physical proof, but we might have inklings or suspicions or ghosts, you know, in a way. So that there's sort of like the technical thing, we can like use linked open data, but that's really privileging the institutions that can afford someone who can spend the time on linked open data, and that's not many archives, to be honest. So, yeah.
What's the name of the critical population?
Oh, Saida Hartman, she's brilliant. And her work is, I'll have to Google the title. It's like The Tale of Two Venuses, where she starts to map out this, both the promise and the perils of what she calls critical fabulation. And she's engaged with like slavery studies. So she's looking at women, particularly girls, who are cataloged in slave records, but there's only like the barest evidence. And she's like, what happened to these girls? You know, like what was the space in which they were living and dying? And so she starts to begin to tell these stories. And so there is a point where she comes up to the limits of that and starts to reject that as a method, but then there's some real potential there. And her last name is Hartman, it's Hartman. But I really like her use of that sort of critical speculation, because she's not speculating wildly. I mean, she's like taking her great expertise and saying, there's this possibility here. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I can't quite formulate a question for you. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I was really fascinated by the ways that African American scholars are shaping the conversations about like what gets lost and what doesn't appear in the archive. So I appreciated those various examples.
Oh, thank you.
Jessica May Johnson,
Yeah.
and even Moya Bailey's work, which
Yeah.
is already like engaging science fiction
Mm-hmm.
and digital humanities has been for a while.
Yeah, and I think Rashida Phillips, she's the co-director of the Community Futures Lab. I mean, her professional hat is lawyer, but she's also a science fiction writer, and I think she's doing some really amazing work and sort of thinking through, like, what are the stories that are valuable to catch, and then, like, how do we, as community members, sort of steward those forward? And I really love her work on, like, speaking into being. Like, and she has this great understanding, and she's within like a sort of the Afrofuturism's speculative past and sort of speculative futures. But I think, to be all cards on the table, I'm so influenced and shaped by the work of Hume, which I think is the project on African American digital humanities. So I think my citations have like drifted over to more African American scholars, but I think that ends up speaking back to the digital humanities in a really powerful way. So I try to, I mean, like, we could use Lowenthal talking about like malleable paths, but I think there's more fruit in sort of thinking about how these malleable paths are then deployed to imagine the future. And I think Jared Drake's work on abolitionist archives is really interesting, because he's creating a sort of a way of thinking about community and grassroots archives. And in his work, they're mainly like police violence archives and sort of testimonial truth and reconciliation kind of recordings that are then deployed to make policy changes. And I think that sort of work of like gathering stories and then really using those stories to make real structural changes is something that's very compelling to me. And I think that a lot of the work of digital humanities can start to be engaged with that. Like, it doesn't have to be completely non-actionable, right? Like it can be actionable, like our work should be actionable. So thank you. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship with Hume and MITH?
Sure.
For those of us who are not fully familiar with it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Hume, which is, I have to write it down because I always misspeak it. So it's the African American Digital History, Culture, and Digital Humanities. So why they put digital twice? I was not in charge of the acronym. Don't tweet that. But I think that, so anyhow, the African American Digital Humanities project is funded by Mellon, and it's co-partnered between the College of Arts and Humanities at Maryland and MITH, which is the sort of DH Institute at Maryland. And the goal was to, the main question driving this project is like, what happens to the shape of digital humanities when we center Black experience? How does that automatically and fundamentally change the way we talk about teaching tools? So I can teach you how to make a map, right? But if we center the Black experience, then we can talk about things like how boundaries are drawn, what kind of power assertions are within the map, what's made visible in a map that then might be a better conversation protected in an enclave. So there are conversations that sort of theoretically emerge when we engage with the critical tools that help us better think about which tools and which approach might work, and then like what kinds of questions we should and could be asking. So Hume has a series of digital humanities incubators where we do some of that skill training. It's a slower model because I'm not going to teach, or actually I wouldn't be teaching, but my colleague Raf and Jessica Liu would be teaching text encoding. But in that conversation, it's going to take us a little longer because we're going to talk about what it means to name something and what kind of power is deployed in that naming. So there is that kind of back and forth between the technical skill and the theory and praxis of that skill. So that's one sort of set of workshops. There is a series of conversations which bring scholars into conversation around things like Tuesday, Jared Drake gave the digital dialogue on abolitionist archives, and then that Wednesday following, there was a conversation around radical archives that had 3 other panelists and sort of had a broader conversation. So it's less about a technical skill and more about like situating this idea or this concept in a broader scholarly conversation. And then the thing that I think is one of the most powerful aspects of Hume is that there's an invitation for students and faculty to bring their digital idea or their digital project and workshop it with others. So MITH staff and with the community that's kind of growing up around the Hume group. And then there's a series of Hume scholars which include faculty from some of the HBCUs around the University of Maryland and some students that are both from Maryland and external to Maryland. So there's a limited amount of support and then some support to build a digital project. So MITH acts as like the technical consultations with advising things like how do you host something, or like what kinds of technical approach might be best for this particular question. And so it's a series of, it's an ecosystem of community building and sort of thinking about DH. So I'm not sure if that fully answered Gabby's question or like overshared, so. Yeah.
I got a phone call, sorry.
Oh, no.
No, I just thought that because here at the University of Houston, we are, very new into, falling into digital humanities, and I thought it would be good to see how at MITH that has this established digital humanities center is working with a specific program that has like a very strong foundation, and like Rachel just pointed out, I mean, it is so important to see the work and the experience of the African American community shaping, right, and laying a very strong foundation for digital humanities. I feel that we can only like stand on those shoulders to continue with the work, of maybe like US Latino, any other minorities who can see how their work has not been reflected, especially through the archives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like Art Público and then the Recovery Project are amazing like resources. I mean, so Hume has a small amount of money to digitize a piece of an AFL-CIO labor collection and some of the Driscoll archives. So there's an art archive about David C. Driscoll, who was a leader in African American art, fantastic collector and sort of thinker about African American art. But with the Recovery Project, you don't have to gather disparate, I mean, you are gathering disparate sources, but you have a great deal already. And I think that you're right, like the sort of concerns are shared and then they diverge in really interesting ways that I think should have a richer conversation about like the shape of the digital humanities. So yeah.
So can you do digital humanities without social justice?
Personally, I don't think you can. I mean, like, yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I don't think that you can. I mean, as an archivist, that there's nothing neutral. And I mean, there's no neutral scholarship, there's no neutral archive, there's no neutral scholarship, there's nothing. You know, everything that we do is built on assumptions and sort of our contextualized cultural moment. And if we can't at least document like why we're doing the things we're doing, then, you know, I think, so yes, all cards on the table. I don't think that you can do DH without social justice. I know there are people who disagree with me, but I think that the minute that anyone starts to like double down on their assertion that something is neutral, that's a flag to be like, that's not neutral. You know, like I just don't think it's possible. And I also think, particularly given this moment, that we are seeing like mass extinctions, and looking at some of the Anthropocene literature, like these things are not disconnected, like they're chain effects, right? And the tension is like panicking, like a full-bore panic, and just like, oh, we're all gonna die, right? I mean, we can't do that. I've got a child, you know, like I can't live in that space, right? So like, I tend to lean really hard on like Anna Singh and her collaborators with like what grows in the broken pieces, you know, like what grows in the space in which we have destroyed things. The other piece that I sort of lean on, and now I need to stop saying this because I've said it like 3 different places, like publicly, but Rosie Warren and China Mieville and some of the editors of a journal called Salvage, in their 4th perspective, notes from the editor, they have the sentence, it's kind of buried, but they say the infrastructures against social misery have yet to be built. And I feel like that is our call, right? Like, and I think that that's why some of this work is so compelling to me, is like, can we imagine in our day-to-day work what infrastructures for social joy, for protection and growth look like? And then can we start to build them? And I think that it has to be local, it has to be small, and there are things that will be bound to be highly disappointing, but then there are things that will survive, you know, like the dandelions that grow. I don't know about y'all, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and it's like, you know, raid central. So like nothing should grow in the sidewalks of Florida because it's like pesticides and anti-cockroach, but these things grow. So like looking for that, I think is like, so yes, this is my long answer. I should be more succinct. Like, yes, I don't think you can be involved in DH without engaged in social justice, even though that is not necessarily the universal concept across DH. But I also think that if we lean really hard on thinking about what kinds of infrastructures we can grow and build and speak into being, we have a better path forward. So, yeah.
I think that example brought me right back to African American studies.
Mm-hmm.
This past week I was teaching The Blue Sky by Toni Morrison, and that's very, you know, she gives this example of the dandelions that shouldn't be going up to the cracks.
But they do.
This example of what, yes, abject blackness and why, what are the insights from seeing that marginalized communities?
Yeah, and I think like one of the things that Catherine Knight Steele, who's the director of Hume, and Jovan Bickerstaff, who's a postdoc, they both lean really hard against sort of deficit studies. They lean really, really hard on like Black joy. And so I think that sort of interplay of like, yes, there are like massive disadvantages and very real structural oppressions that can't be erased because we're focused on joy, but that doesn't deny joy exists, right? And it's that sort of like flexible, creative remixing that I think is really important, you know? Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
No?
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We
And
appreciate the opportunity.
thank you.
And so, like I said at the beginning, we have a couple of spaces for the workshop tomorrow. We look forward Quality Studies. And we have, back there, we have flyers for our next speaker, and please take a sticker to start promoting and creating a presence for our US Latino Digital Humanities Center. And also, we use the hashtag USLDH to tag anything, any digital humanities project or anything that's related to US Latinos and digital humanities. So thank you again, and thank you,
Thank you.
for your visit and your wonderful talk.
Thank you.